All right. They'll be here in 10 minutes.
They'll be.
Okay. Yours on. Yours. Perfect. Actually, I'm going to steal this from you for 1 minute. Sure. Because I'm going to need it. All right. Everyone, welcome. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. Welcome tonight to Newport Art Museum. Thank you so much for being here. My name's Kristen Searles-Bilodeau. I'm the Director of Community Engagement here at the museum. So happy to have Dr. Sunita Puri and Jordan Seaberry here for an artist talk in the gallery, which is really a lovely opportunity to see the work and talk about it at the same time. Doesn't always happen that way. We have a lot of virtual guests who are joining us. I just want you to know that there is a Q&A function, and when we're towards the end of the talk, feel free, please, to jump in and text your questions through the Q&A function, and we'll be monitoring it. So we'll pepper those in with in-person questions. And I'd like to introduce Pilar Forrest, who assisted in curating this exhibition. She's going to introduce our two speakers today. Come on over here, Pilar, so you can use this little guy. That's the volume.
Is this good, Chris? Alrighty. Well, hello. Yes, I am Pilar Forrest. I am the curatorial fellow here at the Newport Art Museum. I was super excited to have the opportunity to work on this exhibition. So today we warmly welcome Jordan Seaberry, over here on the right, and Dr. Sunita Puri, over here on the left, the collaborative minds behind its conception. Jordan Seaberry is a painter, legislative advocate, community organizer, and educator. He earned a BFA in painting from the Rhode Island School of Design and an MS in law from Roger Williams University School of Law. Dr. Sunita Puri is an esteemed writer and presently serves as the program director of the Hospice and Palliative Medicine Fellowship Program at the UMass Chan School of Medicine. She attained her MD and finished residency training at the University of California at San Francisco School of Medicine, followed by fellowship training in hospice and palliative medicine at Stanford University. So let us jump right in. So Jordan and Dr. Puri, if you could please start us off with telling us how you met and how this idea came to be.
Sure. Mic reattachment. Well, while you do that, I'll describe how we met. Sunita and I met.
That's going to work. I just have to. Thank you so much. All right. I think having some technical difficulties up here. Thank you.
So Sunita and I, we met in 2022?
2022? Yeah.
2022.
2 years ago.
At a residency called Yaddo in Saratoga Springs, New York, which is just an incredible oasis of pine trees and deer and gophers and artists. It's an artist residency designed to host writers, composers, and visual artists all alongside one another. And Sunita and I got to meet in the last days. My first days were the last of her residency there. And we just had a few short days to get to know each other quickly. But almost immediately, we realized we were cut from a very similar, strange cloth.
Yes.
You were working on your
So
writing piece.
I'm going to put my water down so that there's no. I feel like I've had to rearrange a lot of things here. Hello, audience, virtually and in person. So yeah, I was working. We met, I think, in early June 2022. So we're coming up on our 2-year friendship anniversary. Yay! And I was working, and still I'm working on my second book. But at the time, I was really in the midst of coming up with the proposal. So I was working on that in a couple smaller pieces, and it was the first time I had a month at a residency. Because of the schedules, just generally in the hospital, I usually could only get 10 days, but this was a special time. So I was able to take a month off, and actually that meant I could socialize with people and not just hide away being like, oh my God, I have to work, because I have to go back to work. So Jordan was one of the people I was immediately drawn to because of, I'm going to use a very California word, his energy. But also, I know, right?
My vibes.
Vibes. But a lot of what we kind of clicked on was our sense of humor, our artistic outlook on things. Jordan read a really beautiful, moving piece of writing about his family history when we were all doing a sharing towards the end of my time there. And we just stayed in really close touch because I am in Worcester currently and Jordan is in Providence. And so that's kind of how things started. But we have been very close over the past 2 years since I've been living here as well. So.
And I think pretty early on, we started realizing that there was some possibility for a collaboration. We started brainstorming. We would go out to dinner and just say, well, there's something here. It was just beyond our fingertips for over a year before we really started drilling in to figure out how we could bring our practices together. And for me, the thing that really gave urgency to me was Sunita's writing, in particular a piece in the New York Times about how traumatizing it can be to provide CPR to patients, and therein what we ask of the dying to give to us, that we inherently or sort of implicitly ask folks in our lives who are on the edge of death to comfort us, to give us little nuggets of wisdom and give us, sort of roadmap for how to deal with their death. And that burden, that sense of burden was really powerful for me to consider. And in my career, I have worked in a lot of proximity to death, but it has always been in the way that I think our society thinks of it, which is a taboo, something, not to talk about, something to be terrified of. I started out as an organizer working on criminal justice legislation I was 19, I was a baby. And the first campaign I worked on was to try to secure a stay of execution for an inmate in Georgia who was on death row, and there was a good amount of evidence that could have exonerated him. And I was a young organizer, just getting my feet under me, working on trying to keep this person alive. And we lost that campaign. He was executed. And it really quickly showed to me what the stakes of that community work could be. After that, I went back to RISD and then to the Nonviolence Institute, where we were doing gang intervention work, and I became their director of public policy, but had also been their homicide victim advocate, which meant I was working with families who had lost someone to violence. Again, sort of proximity to death, but right alongside real pain, real trauma. And so for me, it was such a powerful reframe to absorb some of Sunita's writings and understand that death didn't have to be the way that we think of it, as this scar, as this severance, but that it actually could be something where the dying can have autonomy and grace and power in how they move on to the next chapter, whatever belief system folks have. I found that really compelling. And, the day I realized that we really needed to figure this out was when I was on a run with a close friend of mine, and I mentioned that my grandmother had passed many months before. And he stopped running. He's in training for the Olympics. So for him to stop running, and he stopped running and he goes, "I didn't know your grandmother passed." I said, "Oh yeah, she passed back in April." And he said, why did you never say anything to me? And I realized in that moment that I just hadn't dealt with it myself. I didn't even realize I hadn't communicated about it to this person who's close to me. I had just kept it inside. And so I realized then that I needed myself a way to grapple with these ideas. And Sunita's writings were a perfect introduction to that.
Well, that is so kind of you to say, Jordan. And I think that something I should say is ever since 2022, I have sent everything I've written to Jordan for his feedback. As a writer, we all know this in the writing world. You want to have a small group of people who you really trust to tell you the truth about whether something you're doing totally sucks or is speaking to someone beyond yourself and your crazy little mind. And, I remember the time that Jordan and I talked about his work with people who had lost loved ones to violence, and just how it kind of stopped me in my tracks. And as we were thinking about what it means that our society doesn't really have a great language for loss or for grief, or we think about it in ways that we should just be moving on. Time heals all wounds, these kind of cliches that step in for real sentiment and meaning. And some of this exists even beyond the realm of language. It exists in the body. It exists in places where our feelings are lodged. And what does it mean to move through that? But also, what does it mean for art and artists and writers to help people move through that by sharing experience that is universal, but at the same time is personal? And that's really the perfect marriage, right? Everything Jordan has made here, and I want to ask you some questions about your process here, but everything he's made here is born of his relationship with his grandmother. But as each of you stop by each of these beautiful creations, what he has done so well is create things that will help you tap into your own loss, into something that has been hard to integrate into your life, whether it's a death or another type of loss or another type of trauma. And this is what I think is the task of artists in society, whatever their stripe. How can you marry the personal and the universal? How can you take something that happened to you and make it relevant to other people, to give language and feeling in the body that you may not have been able to find yourself in the throes of what you were going through? And so, Jordan, I just want to kind of ask you to share, what was the moment when you knew that this was going to be both about the patients you spoke with, but also very deeply about your grandmother?
Well, so even backing up before that,
Back it up.
when I first started really thinking about how these paintings could come together, it wasn't, not only was I not thinking about my grandmother, I wasn't even really thinking about myself. I was thinking about something about an experience that was somehow, it seems so naive to say in hindsight. But yeah, I really thought I was making paintings about something that was somehow dislocated from my own experience. And when I realized how dumb I was being was right at the beginning. One of the earliest decisions I made about these pieces was the shape of the canvases, which is not something I have ever done before. Every piece I have ever worked on has been a traditional sort of flat surface. And I decided very early on that I wanted these pieces to each have a unique sloped shape, which in my mind references a medical bed, a different way of laying with your legs or your head sort of elevated. And I built a prototype canvas and I said, this is too on the nose. It's a little obvious. It's sort of, silly. And I built this prototype canvas, which was about maybe 2/3 the size of these. And I had to, when you have a canvas, you have to prepare it first. You have to put a primer on it and then sand it and primer and sand it and primer and sand it. And that first, usually it's sort of like automaton movement, arm up, arm to the side, arm up to the side. And with this shape, which was sort of that first prototype was most similar to the piece on the back wall here, where it had this one slope, and it meant that I couldn't prepare it on the wall. I had to lay it flat on the big work table and pull the primer from one side to the other, from the flat side up to the slope. And immediately, I realized how differently this canvas engaged with my own body, that the physical experience was so much more like a caress than it was this, sort of mindless kind of preparation movement. Immediately, I said, "What is happening?" As I'm putting this primer, and that immediately reshaped my own relationship to these physically. And that's when I said, "Okay, this is more than just the shaped canvas. This is how I'm going to relate to these on the wall. That they're going to peer down at me, and I'm going to be able to look down at them, and we're on different levels constantly and trying to negotiate, a sort of space together." So before it even approached having any relationship to my grandmother, it really surprised me in how it had this relationship to myself. My grandmother didn't come whistling around the corner as she always did, until much later when I was in conversation with the patients that we were working with. Then I really started feeling as if I was looking in a mirror in some ways. That one really crept up on me slowly.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, another example of how when people are in a space where they can really share what is real for them, as opposed to how much we carry the unreal or how much we're expected to diminish who we really are and our authenticity, oftentimes moving around in the world. I think many people who are dying, number one, they're still living. And I think we sometimes forget that.
Yeah.
That we kind of expect a great transformation that may be a benefit to ourselves, right, as recipients of the great wisdom of the dying, but many of them are still who they were. But I have observed that there is sometimes a greater amount of authenticity that can come through when people feel free. And I think there is a part of the process of dying and letting go that allows for a specific type of freedom. And when we have that freedom, we can share stories that we may have been too inhibited to share before, or go into feelings that may have been too challenging. And there, we can locate the universal in the personal story we're sharing. So it sounds like hearing some of the kind of unvarnished stories of the people that you met helped lock into something very universal that spoke to you as a human being. Could you tell us a little bit more about what it was like to sit with people and what you learned that was surprising, and what both about others and yourself?
Yeah, of course. So for folks who aren't familiar with the sort of structure of the project, Sunita used the word freedom, but really for me, the central word is trust. I was very lucky to work with Sunita and have Sunita and the team at UMass Memorial broker these sort of conversations with patients who were in hospice and palliative care. So were facing death head on. And the relationships that Sunita and the rest of the team had built with these folks meant that they were willing to let in some weird painter who they weren't quite sure what he wanted to do. Is he painting portraits of people?
Shady character.
Yeah. But it was the trust that you had built that allowed for those relationships to come through. So some of it is freedom, but a lot of it is trust. A lot of it is having people in your corner who understand what you're going through. And I don't think there's anybody who understands better than Sunita. Hi, family. Oh, Mama Shirley. Oh, yeah, you guys get the front row. Sorry, brief familial intermission. So structurally, we were able to set up these interviews with patients throughout the area. And I sat down with these folks. Hi. I sat down with these folks and was able to try and get a sense not only of the experience that they were going through, but also what they wanted us as a society to be doing differently in the way that we think about death.
Yeah.
What, if they could change one thing about how we think about it, what would that be? And there were so many through lines that I found, interview after interview, conversation after conversation, that it's so silly to say, but it is the only thing, it is the one central thing that every single human being has in common. Yeah. And the challenge is that because we silence it so much, we don't learn from that. We can't, we can't build wisdom from that because we're afraid of it. These are folks that we put away.
Yeah.
We shy away from. I cannot tell you how many folks who throughout my career, the sort of proximity to death in my career, how many folks have said, "Oh my God, how do you do that? Oh, it must be so, draining. Must be so depressing." And to feel that way is so sad to me because you're missing so much nourishment from this critical stage of life that we're just afraid to even think about, let alone talk about. So some of that for me formally came in these paintings, that once I settled that there was this sort of relationship between the patients and my own grandmother's dying, I started going through photographs of my grandmother. And originally I started with these photos where she's a little more glamorous, maybe, as she might want to be remembered, as family might sort of immediately want her to be remembered. A poem that she had published, a photo where her hair is just like on point. And there was this other photo of her last day that I had never had the strength to look at. It was in the Google Drive along with all the others, and I just, as far as I could tell, it wasn't my grandma.
Yeah.
She didn't, it was some other person who had inhabited that body for that last week. And I just could not bring myself to confront it. And so, because my painting process is one where I never know what any of these will look like at the end, I embark on them in total confusion and befuddlement right up until the finish line. I realized that I needed to, for this final piece, I needed to take that photo and attach it directly to the canvas so that I would have no choice but to confront it. Every day I came in the studio, I had to paint around that photo. And in time, these are months and months in the making, and in time, the amount of attention that I required myself to give that photo, now I see how beautiful it is and how unafraid we should be of that last day. And that is, in fact, not only is that my grandmother, that's all of my grandmother. That's every day that she has lived from 1920 up until 2021. And, I guess one of the things that I'm really interested in, and I should have done this before the live stream. I haven't really had a conversation with my family about this show yet. But I know there are family members who would see this painting and say, why would you do that?
Yeah.
What's your deal? And I understand that, because before doing that, I would have said the same thing. If someone made a painting about my grandmother and used that photo, I would say, that's not how she wants to be remembered. That's not how we want to remember her. But that is her.
Yep.
That is every bit as much her as this one. And the more we refuse to confront that, the longer it is before we accept any of the folks in our lives for who they are.
You're getting at something really important, especially when you look at this photo over here of your grandmother when she was young and just in her final days. Who she is not what her body looks like there. Mm. And I think that's something in our society that when we talk about confronting what it means to die, what it means to be mortal, essentially what it means to be impermanent, right? What it means to live with the certainty of change, no matter what that change is, whether it's a flower that dies or our own bodies changing. It is really that philosophy of impermanence that applies. But even though our bodies change, who we fundamentally are has nothing to do with our bodies and how they change. And that's a really hard thing to start to think about and to come to terms with. But it is a very gentle opening into what it would mean not just to confront, but to embrace, the more gentle embrace of how we change as human beings, how our soul is different from these robes that we wear. In the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, there's a beautiful couplet that translated says, "The soul wears the body like a cloth and discards it at the time of death." And I think many spiritual philosophies kind of have that same outlook about what it means to be mortal, what it means to be immortal, what actually lives on, how our loved ones live on through us. And that has nothing to do with the changing body, but has everything to do with the relationships that we build with people. And memory is a form of transcendence of the body, right? And so I think what you're getting at is so incredibly powerful that unless we find a way, and even beyond philosophy or spirituality, organized religion, how do we confront change, right? Because that's what thrums beneath what it means to talk about impermanence, what it means to talk about loss. We lose parts of ourselves, right? Parts of ourselves die through our life experience. We shed things, be they relationships or parts of ourselves that are too heavy to carry forward. How could we start there with just contemplation of that to move into the deeper and more profound confrontation with letting go of the ultimate separation, right?
You see why I like going to dinner with her?
At dinner, we talk about a lot of hip hop.
That's true. That's true.
Said back
50-50.
But and everyone
that
got
was a
it.
Juvenile reference.
Yes,
Okay.
it was
Juvenile the artist. I'm not calling
Yes.
your reference Juvenile.
No, I mean it is kind of juvenile, but Juvenile is a fantastic hip hop artist. I will not go into the lyrics of the song. I feel like they're pretty self-explanatory, but yeah, we need those. That's the other thing is levity is important, right? When we're talking about these things, I feel like if I don't make a patient or family member laugh at least once in my relationship with them, I've done something wrong, because we need that levity, right? When you were sitting with people, could you talk a bit more about what those exchanges were like on both sides? Like, take us into maybe one conversation that really leaps to mind.
Yeah, the conversations really ran the gamut. And like you were mentioning, a lot of how folks on an individual level are understanding their own death, a lot of that had to do with their spiritual or religious practice. Mm-hmm. So there were a lot of folks where I would ask, what do you think the next chapter is?
Yeah.
And there were some folks who said, I have no idea, and that's fine. And there were other folks who were very clear that I'm going to see my son again. I'm going to see my husband again. I will be reunited with them, and we will live in eternity together. And there were other folks for whom, and that brought a sense of security and comfort and warmth. And yet there were other folks who had no such belief system, had no clue, and weren't frankly interested in figuring it out at this point. They said, it's happening whether I like it or not.
Yeah.
I don't know what's coming next, but it's going to happen. And there was some comfort in that as well. It was a sort of release of control, a release of having to know. We spend so much time in our lives agonizing over what it might mean to die, what might be next. And yet the closer folks got, they, at least in these conversations, they went one way or the other. They were either 100% certain they knew what was coming, or perfectly happy being completely clueless.
Yeah.
And for me, it's very interesting. I am an atheist. And so being in these conversations and trying to reconcile, what could that mean in this other frame? What is the next chapter? Those questions on a personal level were also really moving for me too.
Yep.
But I think that one thing that really marked the conversations I had with folks, one that really jumps out at me is the difference and it's really tragic, but how dying is impacted by class.
Mm-hmm.
How much of your last stretch of time in your physical form is dictated by something as arbitrary as money.
Yes.
Whether you are able to be at home with family members where you've lived for the last 30 years, or whether you're in a facility surrounded by strangers and maybe not getting visited by anybody regularly.
Yeah.
It's, there's internally, I found a lot of similarity in the experiences. Folks were wrestling with some of the same questions. But in terms of the external factors, how you live, it is so dictated by financial status.
Yep.
And it was that I found really heartbreaking. And that shows up in a few of the paintings as well. The sort of closed fist with the gold chain is control and,
Yep.
and wealth. I really found that. I'm sure you have experienced that 1,000-fold.
Absolutely. And I think this is actually just as a point of reflection really important, because my first job out of my training, it's been 10 years since I finished, which is like crazy to me. I don't know what I was doing all these years, clearly listening to a lot of juvenile and other people.
Yeah, maybe writing a book.
And then maybe seeing a few patients on the side. But my first job, part of it was doing hospice home visits in South LA. And I saw firsthand how if you have money, you can die at home with comfort and security, because hospice cannot give you paid caregivers. They can't give you, a family that doesn't have to work 3 jobs just to stay afloat. So a lot of my patients, number one, were dying an average of 12 to 15 years younger in those zip codes than people 10 miles away on the glossy side of Los Angeles. So they were dying younger, they were diagnosed later. And all of the inequalities that structured their lives became inequalities that structured their deaths. And so dying at home is actually...
Have you written that before? Because that was...
Yes.
Okay, good. That was really good.
I had written... That was my first piece for the New York Times back in 2016.
Good.
And I chose...
Just checking.
Usually editors will not let you mess with the headlines, but they took this one, which was Unequal Lives, Unequal Deaths. And so but it was shocking. I had just come out of my training. I was like, I have no idea how to manage this. Mm-hmm. So for the families, it's overwhelming. And for the providers, it's also really hard, because I remember showing up to someone's home and this person had ALS and could barely breathe. And when I came home to see him, there was no one responding to the knock at the door. It was a scheduled visit. So I just went in, and he was gasping because there was no one to give him the morphine to relieve his anxiety and his shortness of breath. And so I remember the conversation on the hospice team was, can we safely keep him on our service? Mm. And I was horrified. I was like, can't abandon this guy, but there are many considerations that go into, can we even care for this person safely? And that is the tragedy of this man, having been an undocumented immigrant with kids that were, making money, working 3 different jobs each, all cash. It was awful. And it was something that you realize that dying is in many ways out of our control, but there's certain things that you really wish could be in our control, like giving people equity and real dignity at the end, and not consigning people to a nursing home covered by Medi-Cal when there's no way they can be at home and where they live their lives. So this is actually something that people's dying experiences and then their loved ones' experience of loss is inflected by that guilt. How I could not do anything to give my dad the death he deserved, for example, which is what the son of that patient said to me. So this is a really observant point. It inflects grief, right? It changes our experiences of loss when there are things that we feel are fundamentally wrong in our society that intervene on the most profound transformation we're seeing somebody go through.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. And the thing that stops it from being able to change at any meaningful level in society is that we are so afraid to talk about it.
Yes.
Because the more, these visits were very private. Some folks were extremely isolated to the point of real loneliness. And the more we atomize death, the less we have to confront it. Just like the photograph. I chose to confront that photograph, but I was perfectly able to never look at it, never, let it sit in the Google photos forever. And because we don't require ourselves to confront that, I mean, how could we possibly change it? The more individualized this process is, the more folks just go through it on your own. And again, yes, external things are very different. Class-wise, we're very different. But the internal questions were remarkably similar.
Yeah.
And so the more isolated you feel, the less you realize that you're asking the same questions that other folks are asking. And that makes it all the more hard to actually get answers. When I was working as a victim advocate, I worked with families who were, absolutely living way below the poverty line in really, really challenging circumstances. But I also worked with families who were very comfortable and affluent. And the reason this felt so different is because nobody prepares to lose a loved one to violence.
Yeah.
Nobody has a savings account dedicated in case my loved one is, in a drug deal gone bad or something like that. And that affects rich and poor. And so that type of grieving I found relatively similar across class lines because it was such a shock, such a surprise. And folks are stuck wrestling with it regardless. But in this case, because there is so much preparation and so much of that is reflected by economic status, it became really stark to me.
Yeah.
And it feels like something that we can change and confront. And I think your writing does that really beautifully. It is my hope that these paintings get a slice of that.
Yes.
The ability for us to confront these questions as a society. There is no possibility to change it until we're willing to look at it straight in the face.
And I think that word look is really important because I've observed that a lot of my patients and their families tell me in different words than this, but what it comes down to is just how unseen and unheard they feel, right? That when we don't even have language to really talk meaningfully about things like brevity and impermanence and the constancy of change, then how can we make somebody feel seen and heard in that? As you mentioned earlier, as medicine became more advanced, death became consigned to hospitals, the wards and the ICUs and nursing homes. So the physical location of death has changed. We can hide it, right?
Remove it from your imagination.
In routine visits with oncologists or cardiologists, sometimes that is the very last thing that's ever going to come up because some of my colleagues are like, if I bring up this conversation, someone might think I'm giving up on them. The patient thinks if the doctor's not bringing it up, that I'm in the clear. Exactly. So you get caught in this loop of silence where two people are looking at each other and just waiting for the other one to make the first move. And then I roll up and I'm like, hey guys,
can we talk about death and dying, please?
That's exactly what I do. That's what But I think there's something very powerful about helping people to be seen. And I think that's the power of what you've done here is when I looked for the first time at these creations, they're not just, I really think the word creation is the word that I choose to call these things because they're not just paintings. They're deeply engaged with nature for one thing. So there's actual bark of trees, there's leaves. And I think that is something, there's so much homage to the natural world in this. And even when we can't see the transformations that are hard to see or acknowledge, we can see the transformation in the natural world. So it's one beautiful thing that among many that Jordan has done here is really interweave, try to remind us that loss and change is natural. And we have forgotten that as a society.
Yeah.
Medicine, I sometimes will tell my patients this sentence that medicine will never win against nature. So how can we move into that understanding together? That's not my first line. I don't roll up like oncologist. Never win against nature.
Talk about death and dying because nature is gonna win.
Yeah, the tree outside sent me in here. And he was like, just tell him what's up. But I do think that's a fundamental truth. We can look to nature as a teacher. We can remember our bodies born of nature. And we see nature and loss reflected in all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what specific materials you included and why?
Yeah. I haven't talked about that a ton, and that feels almost like the most obvious thing. I sort of forget about it because I spent so much time with these, but I showed them to someone and they were like, what the hell what is all that? Very early on. So I knew when I was making the canvases, my life would have been much easier if I had made these as panels, wood panels, much more easy to shape, much more easy to attach materials. But I really emphatically wanted them to be canvases because I wanted them to be in the language of painting. I wanted them to announce themselves as paintings, despite the shape and the materials and everything else. But very early on in my conversations with folks and my own reflection on what it would mean to confront death, trees very quickly became the central metaphor, in particular aspens, which I am a camping, hiking, freak. So I could talk about trees for the remainder of the evening. I will not do that. I do believe that there is nothing in life that we can learn that a tree can't teach us. But I knew, so aspens, very few of which grow from seed. The vast majority of them are the organism itself is actually underground, and the tree is sprouting out from that singular organism. The largest living organism on Earth is an aspen grove. And so very early, that sort of quiet underground growth, the community that goes unseen, the connectedness that goes unseen. We see aspens as trees, and really they're more like a forest unto themselves. They are a living creature connected.
And I did not know that, by the way. This was fascinating to me.
Yeah, it's that sort of unspoken connectedness became a real central metaphor. Trees in general, there's a line from Richard Powers that I will butcher it, but essentially that you could argue that a tree's life doesn't begin until it dies, at which point it becomes home to fungus and insects and other creatures, and it just becomes this metropolis. It's teeming with life once it falls to the ground. And that idea, not of decomposition but recomposition, was really important to me. I will credit the Newport Art Museum team for not freaking out when I told them I'm bringing in paintings with 80% just decomposing natural materials on them. They've been really wonderful about it. But I knew that I needed to use the real thing. I needed to have a conversation with these materials. I didn't want to make a simulation of them. Yeah. I wanted to actually wrestle with the materials. And that's, again, I never know in the painting process what an image will look like. I don't sketch them out in advance. I don't plan them. They're entirely just step by step, call and response, element after element. And that means that they can be very confusing. Many a night I have sent my wife a text, an image of the painting saying, I don't know what it wants to do. But slowly over time, I will stop trying to impose what I think the painting wants to be about and really adopt a posture of listening to what the painting is trying to tell me. And it's moments like that when real discovery comes about. For example, in this piece, this did not originally have a giant hole in the middle. It was solid, fully covered with bark. And I started removing the bark, and I wasn't chasing an image. What I decided I wanted to settle on was a type of mark that required me to spend the most amount of time with the bark. So I said, okay, I will make these ripples slowly, and I will follow the outline of every piece of bark just so that I force myself to learn its contours, literally just to spend time with it. And so those marks aren't the result of trying to make an image or an effect. It's just me trying to learn and trying to understand the shape of these really incredible pieces of life. Things like that happen only by listening. This piece here, where the bark and stars are woven together over the surface, in and out across the canvas, that too was a slow discovery. I thought it was, you would laugh if I showed you the photos of when I thought this was done. The slow reveal and conversation with the piece is the painting itself. What exists on the surface very often covers up entirely finished paintings. My wife nearly attacked me when I told her, I think I'm going to just cover up actually 90% of that. What you can see of the surface is maybe, the original surface is maybe 2% of that painting. And that release of preciousness, that release of control, of having to, having it to be what I executed as, right? Coming to the canvas with preset ideas and being able to bend the image to what I want it to be. Yeah. That release of control and preciousness and understanding that you have to risk really beautiful things, that there are moments, painting moments underneath all of these surfaces that I went to bed at night saying, God, that's the best thing I've ever painted. It's so pretty. And then the painting informs me that I have to cover it up, that I have to move on and, have a different conversation with the piece. That's really hard to do. Yeah. And that release of control over and over felt connected to these conversations I was having.
I was just going to say, everything you're saying about an openness to something, whatever comes along, right? Mm-hmm. And really being truly open to that is kind of like what it means to live in a body that is temporary. Knowing that we can't control it. Knowing that we can, I remember in residency, I had 2 patients come in at night on the cardiology service at the county hospital. I was a new second-year resident. It was just me and an intern, and I was terrified. I thought everyone was definitely going to die. And so, and not because of palliative care, but because I was like a bad resident. But no one died, unless it was their time. But sorry.
This is what dinner is like, just for the record.
But 2 people came in. They were both of the same background. They were both Vietnamese. They were both the same age. They had the same health issues. They had the same blockage in the same artery. They did, and both of them arrested. Their hearts stopped, and they both didn't come in at the same time, thank God. But we're a few hours apart. I did the same thing for both of them. One walked out of that hospital, and one died. And I just remember thinking, why, right? And then over the years, really kind of engaged. I never forgot that night. It was a hellish night for everyone involved, and having to tell family we did everything that we were trained to do, but we could not bring him back to you. We could not bring your husband back. Number one, it's horrible to have to say those things, but number 2, it's horrible to sit with the questioning of why not, right? Why did this happen? But it's the being open to the mystery sometimes. To knowing that you can do everything right. You can go to bed thinking, this painting is the best thing I've ever done. It will inform you that there are changes to be made.
Right.
Your body will inform you this time, for whatever reason of this life, this is not enough. And there's a beautiful continuity there about living your life as an artist, but just living your life as a person in the world, wrestling with, why did this not happen? Why could we not save him?
Yeah, so much about medicine and my world of legislative organizing too, which they seem very different, but both of them are very much about controlling outcomes.
Yes.
Both of them are about, I know, and this is not, I'm not talking down on either field, but I know what is best.
Yep.
And I will attain the authority to make that happen. And very often, I mean, I'd like to think that the bills I've written are great. And, and just as I'm sure you would hope that the wisdom that you've used to guide your medical practice has also been right. But it is still ultimately about some amount of control, some amount of exercising of your will over your surroundings. And I believe in that very firmly. I believe in communities having agency and self-determination, and I believe in folks having control over their bodies and their own health, and whether that's reproductive health care or how you die. I believe in that very much. And also, I'm learning what you're describing about how little control there actually is, and that isn't something to be afraid of. That is something to move with.
And this concept of uncertainty, right?
Mm-hmm.
Being with uncertainty is just like being with impermanence. It's just like being with, I'm going to sit down with my materials and I'm going to make something that at this moment speaks to me. The image that I think is what I'm trying to conjure is what I'm going to try to put into a canvas. But I don't know what the final product is going to be. And
Right.
just being open to that it sounds like really
So
helps you
scary.
birth these things that are gorgeous. And I think it's being open to that helps me help my patients the most, because I will tell them part of what we consider ourselves in palliative care is uncertainty experts. Actually, I've stopped using the word expert because I actually don't think I'm expert in anything. And I think that means that is a reflection of what it means to open to uncertainty, is that I have experience, but experience doesn't mean I am expert in every outcome. And so that's my own maturing and engagement with the concept of uncertainty, is that I cannot be certain of anything. And that's the problem, right? How will I help you make decisions about what matters to you in your life, and whether or not chemo or surgery or whatever intervention we're talking about is going to get you there? I can't promise you anything, but what I can promise is an openness to uncertainty that I will try to help you foster, so that you're making informed decisions. So you can if you're open with open palms to what life brings you, when it's so easy to close them in these fists of control, what would change if we opened our palms into this moment?
Yeah. There's one piece of this painting, and then I'm going to check with Pilar on my time check, because I'm ask any of my students. I am awful at keeping time. But in that regard, this painting, which I see as last, each of them is referencing one of the 7 stages of grief, but importantly, they are jumbled. There is no order, because there is no, real coherent quote process that folks go through. You move and bounce and jump, and there aren't clear chapters between them. But this one felt for me like acceptance. And you can see another thing that the museum staff was very gracious about. There's a planter box of soil built into the canvas, and underneath that shelf are strips of UV lights, grow lights. There are seeds in that soil of hostas, my grandmother's favorite plant. And, it's my assumption that they will sprout and they'll germinate and they'll grow. And there's a hinge at the bottom, so I can remove the planter box and put it out in the world after the show. And also, there are 8 trillion different circumstances that the moisture in this room or the temperature or anything could change the outcome of those seeds. And maybe they won't germinate. Maybe I thought I was planting 5 and there's actually 25, and the whole thing just, that won't happen, museum. But that, to relinquish that control and say, I hope you grow, but if you don't, I can accept that too.
Yeah.
That really, for me, sort of sums up why that photo is there. I hope we all live to 150. It's okay if we don't. Okay.
It's a good time to do questions. If anyone has a question for Jordan, you don't have any online yet. I don't know.
I know Jordan very well, but I'm only being Dr. Puri now. I'm really interested what drew you to go into your fields, your area.
Yeah, so
I don't actually know this.
so this was actually part of why I wrote my book was to really navigate that question, because as you were saying, people hear you do palliative care. Number one, no one knows what that is. How many of you have one? Some people can't pronounce it, and I'm cool with that, because it is a hard word to pronounce, and anything that you can't really easily pronounce is automatically like, I don't know what this is. Is it just hospice? Isn't that when you bring in the guillotine? Like, it's just like a lot of, I'm sorry, that's a reference to a surgical resident who asked me when I was a fellow. He was like, if someone's still alive at 6 months when they're on hospice, do you like bring in the guillotine? And I was like, yes, that's what we do. What are you talking about? So anyway, he probably shouldn't be a part of this answer. He was memorable in that way. So I was brought up by very spiritual parents who kind of taught me early on just how change and impermanence is just the fact of life. And I was exposed to this for a long time. I'm going to just be honest. I don't think that I am an enlightened guru or embody this perfectly at all. But it really was startling to me how when I came to med school, it was really all about focus on disease and cure. And if you couldn't fix, quote unquote, someone, meaning really fix their body, then you have failed. And that was really kind of how we are socialized as physicians. And I took a lot of pride when I could diagnose something or help somebody, understand what was wrong with their body and improve their quality of life. But I remember when I was a resident, I was in the ICU, and I did a lot of extra ICU rotations because I loved the ICU for its power, but not really understanding that part of the power of high-tech medicine is the power not only to extend life, but to extend death. And I was in a lot of situations where I was doing things to people, putting them on dialysis, putting them on ventilators, giving them powerful medicines, not really talking about what any of it meant, not really asking them, making space to say, do you understand what's happening to you? What do you understand about what's happening to you? Or the family, asking the family, do you understand what's happening to him? Has he ever talked to you about what he would really want if he were this sick? And if his desired quality of life would be to go back to work, I'm not sure we're ever going to get him there. I could not do that. I wanted to. I really wanted to. And I did a rotation in med school with the palliative care team, which was one of the most inspiring things ever. And I think that, in combination with feeling like I was failing people by not having the language to speak honestly, not making the space to tell them, no matter what you have to ask me, we will be here to answer and hold you with compassion. No concept, no discussion in medical school about the word suffering. No discussion about the word dignity. These things about what it means to be a human being. I had no fluency in any of that. And I found that the most fulfilling moments with my patients were when I could do that for them. When I could say, I have to share some hard things with you. Or when they would ask me, can you just please be honest with me? Because they can feel the withholding. People know when you're not telling them something. And when I could just be honest, the honesty was the compassion. The compassion was not withholding things because I thought I was hurting someone's feelings. The compassion was being vulnerable enough to be honest and letting them in turn be vulnerable. That's a lot of what I get to do in my field. I also get to do things like treat cancer pain, which shockingly, we don't learn good pain management in medical school. Even in my residency, I didn't. It was like, well, I guess I'll give them Norco. I mean, there was there's a way to treat different types of pain that I just didn't learn. And that treating physical suffering, but also treating the existential suffering, like what does my life mean now that I'm sick? The spiritual suffering, why would God do this to me? Or should I go looking for God now? Will that save my life? The emotional suffering, the patient and the family, these are really complex things. And I think I get to be clergy, and I get to be a healer, and I get to be a doctor. And I think all of that is why I wanted to do this. And it's, I think like any part of medicine or nursing, it's all really devastating at times, but it gives so much back. I tell people I get to be a midwife to the other side. I tell my patients I get to walk you to the riverbank. That's a really sacred thing.
Thank you.
There's usually dead silence.
Oh, we have a hand.
Okay.
I just wanted to comment, there are a lot of people, I have a friend who was an emergency room nurse in San Francisco and quit, just left after trying so hard to have the conversations with the administration that you yourself have been able to create an area, in your life for. And there, as you said, nurses and midwives and physicians that don't have license to create those opportunities.
Yeah.
Not only for discussion, but actual action. I mean,
Yeah.
people get fired all the time for honoring a patient's wish.
Yes. And that's
It's really
so true.
dangerous.
And it shouldn't be the purview of just palliative
Right.
care.
Exactly.
Everyone should be able to do this. And we're not giving people skills. But as you said, I think there's a lot of politics around
Tons.
what it means to come in and tell somebody, what do you really want? Because that might mean they don't do the surgery that's going to give the hospital a lot of money. So, money.
Money. Okay, question over here.
Yeah. Well, I first want to just thank you. I'm so glad and grateful that we used to be together and have this collaboration.
Us too. Oh, sorry. Wow, sorry.
Someone that's worked a long time using art and creative writing, and I work most currently, we all know I work at Butler Hospital as an activities therapist.
Oh, wonderful.
And I bring art and reading into the work as much as possible in the groups that I run, and I also bring in outside artists because it's so important. I mean, it's like nothing we go through. And promoting well-being and connecting people to themselves and one another and healing and all that. And so with this collaboration, I'm going to do that. And there is, of course, the field of arts and health and arts and medicine that's gaining traction now. If you have had thoughts about an ongoing presence or the role, you talk about the role of artists and
Yes.
work. If you could see an ongoing role of the arts as being useful in the work that you do, or having an ongoing presence in the work you do. I know that RISD even has a program where they bring in, I think, medical students or something to observe artworks, to build empathy. But, and then another question is, Julie, I was wondering if the folks that you got to speak with got to see any of the art.
Yes, good question. You go first?
So I absolutely think that the arts and the humanities have a vital presence, and that collaboration between healers and artists is so important because, we can teach you a whole book full of scientific facts, but the application of any of that involves some connection to your own humanity and the humanity of others. And I think in our training, we get cut off from our own humanity because we're not allowed to be human, right? If I cried in front of like an attending, I would just keep it all in. And so many people do that because we're not going to get a good grade, right? And so I think like there's a two-pronged part of that, using art to heal patients and families and give them a different way to express what they're going through. But the people in the hospital, and I think the med students, the trainees, but also the attendings, we get kind of forgotten about. But there's so much that comes with that role shift, and we don't have the same support that the trainees have. So having artistic programs for self-expression in safe spaces where people know whatever they say or write or create is not going to go back to their supervisor or the administration, because it's a very judgmental profession. Medicine is a very judgmental profession towards its own. And, even though we're taught not to be judgmental towards patients and families, and I wouldn't say that we're perfect at that at all, but we're at least taught that, I think the outlets would need to be in safe spaces. But I think it is hugely important. Obviously, hospitals are not always interested in funding that, but I think like the volunteerism aspect of it is so important, because I know there are writers and artists out there who would love to be able to offer to the extent that they can, some space for healers to be able to express themselves. And it's always worth going. So patient experience in most hospitals is a really good place to go to try to start a program. And sometimes they have access to funds. And so I really want to encourage you with your skills to keep trying to do it and find ways to continue it, and even get some med students to help expand it. They're always looking for things to do that are fulfilling. And so I highly recommend involving them as well. Nurses too. I think midwives, nurses, even like pharmacists, like everyone who's working in a hospital is suffering to some extent. And that this can be a way to engage with that more actively and really connect them to themselves. And that's something I try to teach my trainees, is your authenticity and who you are is always going to be more important than what you do. And I think this is an important part of that.
You could get med students, or you could get my student. I would also encourage you to think. So I teach at RISD, and I'm always looking for ways to get my artists into the world. So, yeah, I mean, we're weirdos, but we want to get involved in that stuff. So, yeah, let me know, and I'd be happy to plug some folks in. And which is how I started with a painting class where we were at Bradley Children's Hospital, and it was a really important experience for me to really, in a small step, begin to connect my painting practice to this outside world and figure out how to do relationship building through painting, which I think is what you're talking about. It's not about the image. When I did a project where I was working, and if my time check people, okay, just like throw a pebble at my head when it's okay. Yeah, I did a project when I was still a student at RISD where I worked with the families of every homicide victim from the previous year, and this was a long time ago, sadly. And I went to their home sort of similarly. I went to their home, I sat on their couch, I got to know who the family was and who the person who had been killed was, and I painted a portrait of that person, which they then owned, and then larger paintings about this size that sought to tell the story and more of the socio-political context around the person's death. Oh, that's sweet. And the thing that struck me, about a year later, someone asked me this, and not a single family that I worked with had asked to see any of my paintings before I painted their loved one. And it hadn't dawned on me that I was like, oh yeah, nobody asked. Nobody cared, frankly, if I could paint well. Because that was secondary. What mattered was that there was someone who wanted to tell their loved one's story. And whether it looked like a Rembrandt or not, didn't matter. Yeah. All that mattered was that there was someone who was interested in this story and interested in humanizing this person.
And in bearing witness.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, so the reason I bring that up is that painting through connection with community, whether it's Butler, Bradley, UMass, anywhere, painting as a relationship builder, as a trust builder, right? That I had to, in these conversations with folks, I told them all, I'm not painting portraits. I'm not putting any identifying information. You could come look at these paintings and have no idea that they're about you, that my time on your couch has impacted how I'm thinking about these paintings, but that they are seeking to embody that wisdom and the conversations as a whole, what it means to be confronting death, but that they're not person specific. And that I thought would be a huge challenge. I thought folks would push back on that and say, well, I really want you to include this piece of me. But overwhelmingly, folks wanted a conversation at a larger level, something bigger than them. They wanted me to bring these out in the world and have people understand a little bit more clearly why this shouldn't be something to be afraid of, why this has to be something we talk about. And so to your question about have folks seen them? Not yet. Well, some of them. But I am actually working with the museum staff and Kristen in particular on figuring out a way to get folks here if possible. Mobility is a real challenge. We're thinking about like maybe doing some, they're very hard to photograph because they're shaped canvases, but we're trying to figure something out to make that engagement happen, because I do think it's critical that I set out, I started each of these paintings knowing that the people who inspired them may die before they're finished. Mm-hmm. And the amount of responsibility that gets placed on me from that, knowing that it may take me 6 months to finish this painting and this person may die in 2. They may never see these paintings. It became less about this painting is about you and you need to see it, and much more about I hope that you can trust that I will shepherd your story and your wisdom through these works, and that it will live a little bit longer than each of us has on this earth.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Oh, are we good for more questions?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, good. 2 questions.
Okay.
I'm curious if both of you have reflected at all around how we got here culturally, around, our, as far as how we look at death and, looking also at other cultures and how there is a lot more ritual and celebration around death, and just like your reflection on that through this experience.
You go first. I have a dark take.
I think it's a great question. I think that part of it is that we're not really around it very much. I think, even a century ago in the United States, people died much younger than they die now, right? Medicine has enabled a lot of lengthening of life through really important things like vaccines and safer surgeries and safer childbirth. And I think we became more and more distanced from the idea of mortality because we were living longer lives, but being just the way we are together as families has changed. There are really not that many joint households of multiple generations living together the way there are in many other societies in the United States and abroad, right? And so like in India, for example, it is, especially in the rural areas, which is the vast majority of India, people die young. They don't all have the greatest medical care. They live seeing their grandmother or grandfather die because they're all in the same household together. So illness and debility and seeing the body change is a lot more of a normal experience for people outside the United States, where I think increasingly families live apart. There really are not those intergenerational households to the same extent. And we have medicine doing more and more and more. I also think we live in a society that is all about this idea of I can control everything, right? And so there's like a joke that in America, death is optional. And that's kind of how a lot of people around the world see our culture. What's sad is that I think that mentality has been, shipped out to other societies. So like in the big cities in India, for example, in some of the hospitals that are very similar to university hospitals here, you see a lot of the same mentality of I want everything done, more and more and more and more chemo. So a lot of it, I think it's multifactorial, but I think those are huge contributors. And I think also just the departure from religion and spirituality. And let me decouple those actually. I think spirituality is in a different category because I do think there is actually a lot of draw towards spirituality. But I think when you're in a religious community, generally speaking, things like death, the rituals around it are more a part of your everyday. And I think the changing patterns of religious involvement also in the United States has changed that a little bit. And then I think in medicine, of all people, you would think people in medicine and nursing go into their professions knowing we are going to lose people, right? But the way that the technologies are changing and the ways that we are educated snuffs out what is natural. So I think there's social change, there's change just in terms of where death happens, changes in religiosity and issues within medicine. I think all of it kind of comes together, and it's really hard to confront what you can't control and what you don't know anything about. And your point of ritual, we don't have rituals around this, right? We don't really have a way of contending with it. And we live in a society that's pretty disconnected from each other and from our own self. We're taught to be disconnected.
Uh-huh. I'll keep my response brief so as not to provide a bright red socialist manifesto. But I think what Sunita said is correct, and also, to my mind, it's also very much about money. I have often wondered what could bring a society to have elderly homeless folks?
Yeah.
What culture in the history of humankind respects elders so little as to allow them to live in the situations that so many of our elders are living right now? It has always baffled me. Any other time, anywhere, it would be just mind-blowing to walk through my hometown of Chicago and see how many elders are just living in destitution. And I think it's because they're no longer productive for our society. And we are in a society that values, above all else, productivity, youth, and usefulness. And once you are no longer able to produce something, create something that benefits the economy, turn your labor into money in some way, well, you're not very useful anymore. And so it's much easier to cast you aside. I think that's true for elders generally, and I certainly think it's true for the dying. Our economy shapes so much about how we see ourselves and our relationships, which is why things like the nuclear family are so, like, at one time were so unique and bizarre that why wouldn't we live in a compound surrounded by all of our relatives? Why would we be in these tiny little houses as if we're all like little atoms separated? It comes down, to my mind, about how our economy is shaped. And so part of finding some of the sense of freedom that Sunita is talking about on an individual level requires us finding that on a societal level too. Yeah. I really think if you're founding a society tomorrow, one really easy way to make it awful is to couple healthcare and money together. Yes. They just, to my mind, have no business being related. So I will leave it there so as not to bring you to my next meeting.
My question might be comparatively rudimentary talking about, but I just wanted to know if you could shed a little bit of talk about the communicative thread that led you as artists to the works and the repeating of autumn leaves, roses, palms, it looks like. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wonder where that tell them.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief so that no pebbles come in my direction. But echoing through almost all of the pieces are these collage materials. This interaction with natural organic material and trying to pair together these things that will decompose on the surface alongside these things that are, the idea of being immortal. So many artists, one of the things you learn in art school is to make everything archival. And there are entire professions dedicated to making sure that this painting lasts forever and ever and ever. And we will, conservationists are like chemists knowing how to extend the life of paintings. And that sense of, obsessing over making things archival, it has an assumption that this thing is meant to last forever, that its meaning will be outside the bounds of time. And so while these are, I'm not saying they are going to fall apart, Kristen and Pilar and Francine, I am saying that they are directly related to a conversation between, for example, acrylic paint, which is essentially plastic, and these natural materials. So the synthetic versus organic back and forth is here constantly. So for every piece of bark from the ground, there are these synthetic flowers, which really are the sort of icon of funeral arrangements, which again bring to mind, why would we sort of make a simulation of a flower that is intended to last forever as a comment on losing someone to temporality? That back and forth has really guided me through this process. And importantly, you'll see that collage material, that push and pull between organic and synthetic on every piece except the one directly behind you, which that canvas also is the closest to a traditional quote unquote flat surface, even though there is a very slight slope, because that painting is denial. That painting is not yet ready to understand or grapple with what these other paintings are confronting. And so that is the one with no organic material, no process of decomposition or recomposition within it. It essentially thinks it's a normal painting, and it really is bouncing through the different stages that you come, again, moving through the room. These are not in the sort of traditional order, quote unquote. They are meant to be moved between sort of as a person moves through grief, bouncing between stages without clear chapters, and for so many of us doing so alone, thinking that we are the only one experiencing it. It's my hope that this would challenge that and show folks that not only are we doing it in community, we're doing it with non-human creatures and organisms all at the same time. That as we are losing loved ones, trees are falling, bugs are getting stepped on, and they are regrowing. They are seeds at the same time.
Well, thank you very much. That was fun.
Thank you.